Good morning, everybody. And so today, we've heard the story that apparently there's been a New Zealand spy has been kicked out of Russia, or for correction, the Russians have said your embassy's been running a spy, and we've arrested this guy and we're charging him, and it's been run. I won't say which agency it's run because at this stage I've actually only seen as much of the headlines, and I probably know as much as the rest of you guys about it. I will go into that whole situation. I'll break it down, and I'll look at it in comparison in relation to the accusations of a person spying who was in the New Zealand Army, spied for the New Zealand Army, and tried to sell his stuff to the Russians. I'll get into all of that because that's actually quite funny in itself when you actually understand how secrecy and security actually works. And he's even funnier, well, funny in a sort of not so funny kind of way. When I tell you a little story about a friend of mine that he had bipolar, and he ended up basically in a funny farm after he'd actually, turned around and said he was a Russian spy and there was a submarine waiting for him. And that's not actually the truly horrifying, funny bit about that story, but we'll save that one for another day. Well, right after this one, I'll get into that stuff. I'll do a deeper dive, and I'll bring up some of the stuff about and explain also. There's just some very interesting things I'm seeing already because the story is also demonstrating to me instantaneously how little our national media understand New Zealand spycraft or how it actually works. And again, it's quite funny because in the past, Nicky Hager's turned around and has written Secret Powers, which is about the Government Communications Security Bureau. It's a very good book, but it also relies heavily on a lot of what was known existing intelligence beforehand. Nicky, on the other hand, when he's got into the element of human intelligence, which is the case where he was with Jack Sanders, which is another interesting character. He's been, if you want to talk about how foreign intelligence in New Zealand works, then we'll get into Jack Sanders later on. But Nicky got himself in trouble with Jack Sanders because he didn't really understand how spycraft works, which is not the same as signal intelligence, and that kind of came back and slapped him in the face. And our national media generally don't mention that affair because it made their great investigative journalist hero show that he's actually fallible. And I like Nicky, and he's actually very good, but he's not the expert that he claims he is on espionage and spycraft. Um, this situation, however, what is interesting about the situation is that I'll just give you guys a quick breakdown, which is what the point of this video is today, is that basically what you have in New Zealand is you have from the time when I was in actually military intelligence, or sorry, correction, I was in the Royal New Zealand Artillery. I was a signal, and I was an artillery intelligence operator, and then later on, because of that position, basically there wasn't a lot of training going on for RT intelligence at the time when I was in doing my rotation. So I'd get bored and I'd go off and I'd do exercises with the Force Intelligence Group or the Counterintelligence Unit. So I got a lot of training from different branches of the intelligence within the military. And again, they have their own hierarchy. They really only brought in the badge, the Sub Rosa badge, exactly about the same time I came in. And the way that particular organisation was actually run, I will probably get into a little bit deeper, but it always concerned me because they had a lot of external influences from other agencies, or American agencies within our military intelligence, which I had a problem with. And a lot of the people that I mentioned in my book, for example, Les G, that actually were doing quite good intelligence work, they largely got drawn out. Now, these are people that were not necessarily ideologically aligned with me, but they were good, hard-working people, and because of the careers opportunity, factor going on within the Force Intelligence Group, they got pushed out. You had another group within the Army, which was called the CSIS, which is the Centre for Strategic Institute Studies, which weren't technically spies or intelligence, they were more like academics, made up of young officers that went to university, normally like Massey University, and I think they've expanded to other universities since then. Now there's like a little push because since 9/11 we've really gone down the rabbit hole with the American intelligence apparatus, and we're really sucked into this whole thing of being sucked into the Northern Hemisphere's goals, just as we were in World War I and World War Two. And we seem incapable of breaking away and forming our own intelligence, which is, it's just a mindset. There's no way geologically we should be doing this, but here we actually are. And the CSIS as analysts were very, very good. They're very, very, I think they're actually some of the best in the world in terms of doing, being able to look at what's going to happen geopolitically and, pick patterns, and I think they're really damn good. And, it's a shame there's not more work being done on these guys because they're quite remarkable. I mean, I've had some really good conversations with guys from the CSIS. Then you have the New Zealand Intelligence Service, the Security NZSIS. Michael Parker does a really good book, one of the sort of still go-to books on the SIS. and he talks about the SIS being set up, and the first intake of them was actually achieved by Sir Roger Hollis of the Foreign Office in Britain, which becomes kind of curious because when Thomas Pincher, I want to say, he did a big, huge, basically about the extended fifth man, and he put Sir Roger Hollis as being the likely candidate. And there's always been a generally sort of a response from Whitehall of, we're not dismissing it, we're not saying it didn't happen, but we don't want to comment, which is normally kind of euphemism for, like, yeah, you got it right. So that basically meant that the NZIS were compromised, and you kind of get into a whole series about 50s and 60s from New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, which has modern day repercussions when you look at things like the Cameron Ortis situation, which has occurred in Canada, which again is quite interesting because this is a very, very serious spy breach of our agency, and it's gone completely under the waters. Yesterday, I broke a story, well, not broke a story, I went back to a story I'd visited because I found this little news article that I had actually missed, and it was about Jeffrey Palmer talking about how the Russians tried to infiltrate the Labour movement in the 1980s, and that how in his role, I think it was as an Attorney General, like he had to meet people in all ways that he knew that they were being investigated by the SIS, and that was a very uncomfortable situation, and he largely vindicated a lot of what I actually said in my book State Secrets 90, which was published in 1999, and I'm quoting a military intelligence officer who I will out as being Peter Mayer, Colonel Peter Mayer, who was the colonel, the head of Force Intelligence Group when I was working for them, and had a lot of conversations, and where a lot of my book from State Secrets came from conversations with Peter Mayer in relation to the arms black market existing in New Zealand, which again I've talked about with guys like Les G's had actually exposed. And I outed Peter Mayer because basically later on I found out things that he had stated. He had and I'd always been on the lookout for this, and in my book I point this out, and State Secrets too, I follow this up, this suspicion, and demonstrate that actually Peter had actually been throwing me a lot of dodgy shit amongst the stuff that he was telling me that was also true, and therefore basically he was using me as to achieve his own spycraft agenda, which this is what happens in spycraft. I don't actually take that personally against Peter, but that's the rule as a journalist. If you're going to lie to you, then you lose all the protections, the journalist protections, and that's it. So all I was saying about the spies and Labour came from Peter Mayer, and then Sir Geoffrey Peter largely basically actually illustrated it. Now, what I'll get into later on when we look at the Russian situations, we'll also talk about the External Assessment Bureau, the EAB, which was formerly known as External Intelligence Bureau. And in my book, I talk to you about their identification of money laundering and basically some very shifty connections between the Hawke's government and some Chinese groups in Vanuatu, which again we kind of get into. And this gets into a big deal because this goes into the whole dirty money trail that ultimately that Cameron Ortis later got done as a mole for. But this dirty money trail we can track from the 70s to the late 1990s, when my take on it is that I call this dirty money trail, I call it the Ozark after the TV series of the same name. And basically my take on it has always been is that a lot of people that are now crying foul against Putin were very much okay with these shady Russians running around New Zealand trying to fund the New Zealand America's Cup, having connections like Proc Bank with which was tied to Ross Morant, who's now actually put himself up for run in Parliament this particular election. Ross has turned around and spoken about how gangs need to be politicalised. He's basically stimulating what's happening in Fiji. They talk about Operation Bougainville. They talk about grey warfare, which is where basically non-conventional forces have been stirred up to cause these stabilisation patterns, which again I talked about in State Secrets, which has now been acknowledged is actually taking place. And this is the real threat, because the real threat in terms of domestically security I feel, actually comes from corporates, not actually necessarily foreign governments. Not saying that they're not players, but in terms of the destabilisation and this grey warfare factor, it's corporations that concern me more than state players. Pardon me. So the SIS, again, getting to this final point, is that the SIS, or the New Zealand SIS, they handle domestic security. And again, this gets very tricky in New Zealand because we have now got multiple pitch battles between, we've got the Police Intelligence Bureau, which again, a group of people I'm very not very impressed with, and they. I think, in terms of if we had watchers watching the Watchmen, I would be really putting the focus on the Police Intelligence Agency, because I think they've done some really nasty stuff in the past and broken lots of rules, they're way worse than the New Zealand Intelligence Service ever. The NZIS, they're guilty of occasional stealing the occasional pork pie and having a penthouse in their briefcase, but they're not the worst people. Not to say that there isn't shadows of skeleton in the NZIS story, but they're not my primary concern. And they basically do domestic internal intelligence. External intelligence is actually said left to the External Intelligence Bureau, which is now known as the External Assessment Bureau. EAB largely operate out of the Treasury Building in Wellington. They do attachment. I think Chris Laidlaw talked about his horror about running into one of these guys who's trying to play 007 very badly in somewhere in the Pacific. But generally speaking, the EIB, when they actually, they're paper pushers, but when they are carrying out external operations, it's normally limited to operations within the embassy environment. So they might go to cocktails and collect information, and then write these superbly, wonderful spy fiction papers, which are that's what they are, they're fiction, and they get really good expense counts, and it's an incredibly cushy job, and it's full of actually Auckland grammar boys. But they're really not the problem. The reality is that if New Zealand is carrying out any foreign intelligence operations, my experience and people when I wrote State Secrets was that what happens is there's a euphemism which they refer to as the boys. And the boys will normally be, not always, will be limited to people that, in fact, some of the boys are known, worked in the SAS, they trained the SAS, and then they ended up working for oil companies in like Halliburton. But the SAS, normally you get second, like SAS guys that have left the SAS, they've done a lot of, while they were in the SAS, they've done a lot of secondment for like normally the United States Intelligence, or the US alphabet agencies, or the British agencies, and these will be people when we've got an outside situation occurring that one of our allies needs a hand with. They'll ring Wellington. Wellington will talk amongst themselves. They'll turn around and ring some of their corporate friends who've played golf with and part of the old boys network, and say, look, Ron, we've got a bit of a problem here. You wouldn't want to have one of the boys be able to help us out by any chance, would you? And then they put down the phone, and the boys, they will already know who they actually are talking about, and these guys will normally be working in, say, like private security aspects or some kind of consultancy within these large corporations or front businesses, and then they'll get called in to do the foreign operations, and they'll be operating through somebody like the CIA or the MI6. And the idea for the function of what they're doing there is that's all set up to provide limited exposure to New Zealand, so in fact that it goes wrong, that we can claim all plausible deniability. There have been some cases. I think there was a telecommunications expert that was executed in Chechnya. There's a very good probability that he was an example of one of the boys that was sent to do a job, and he got caught up, and that was the unfortunately for that particular gentleman. This case in Russia, I said, haven't read any of the particulars. I've only seen the headlines this morning, which I said occurred ironically a day after I dug up this thing I found this thing about Jeffrey Haarp. I went, hey, wait a minute, that's the thing that I was told that I was a conspiracy theorist for back in 1999 when we launched the book, and we got this best-selling book, and we got it right out there. We outsold on the first day, Nicky Hager, 10-1. And then none of the national media would touch it. And I think Scoop Media, Scoop, which is an online channel, they turned around and did an article explaining the fact that actually, yes, there was this blackout on my book because it had all the stuff in it, which was actually quite damning. And I remember actually on the way, we were driving up to Auckland to do the official launch, and it was the day where the book had actually gone to the press, and there were now actual copies out available. And I actually drove past the Prime Minister's office, come off the Cook Strait Theory, and I was looking up at it, and the lights were on. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning, and I often found myself wondering, going, was that for me? Not saying it actually was, but it was. The book came out, and it did create a lot of kerfuffle behind the scenes, and as a result of it, we got an organised crime bureau set up. And today, when we look at grey warfare, the organised crime thing is a very significant part, because it's actually, these are the real issues, the destabilisation and the role of transnational crime versus state. What will probably happen with this guy is that he'll get abducted. So actually, it'll probably already been predetermined. They'll pick this guy up. It's some guy that has not actually had any access to anything really meaningful. There may actually be, and I'm quite happy to accept that there is a New Zealand embassy. It's probably some EOB boffin, but New Zealand guys will be going SIS, and SIS will get all the claimage, and we won't mention these other agencies that people don't talk about. And there's a whole lot more of them. There's actually, to be honest, if I had to go back in and do state secrets again, I'd have to go for a whole learning process, because since 9/11, there's a whole plethora of alphabet sub-agencies that have branched off, and you also have things like Immigration is getting involved in intelligence agency games. The DIA, the Internal Affairs, is getting involved in, especially online on cyber affairs. Um, and then you have these things like, and that caused problem. The SAS is actually like, one of the things when Israelis were caught spying and they were doing it on pay on behalf of the New Zealand, I think it was immigration actually, the SAS stepped and went, no, 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 and kicked them out of the country, and it wasn't about being Mr. Nice Guy, it was just they didn't like that another agency was spying, treading on their territory, and it was a turf war. Um, and so, all these, and then on top of it, you've got the private sector as well. And again, you have situations like companies like Cobweb Technology, which are firmly embedded within our own intelligence apparatus, and I think they are way more dangerous than we have to worry about the Russians. And again, even in things like the St. John's Ambulance, whose headquarters is in Israel, it means that entire first responders who are plugged into our fire agencies and our first agencies basically means that Israel, through direct connection to our first responder system, can find out anything they actually want. And again, nobody wants to talk about. There is, in my experience, a complete absence of counterintelligence awareness within our entire intelligence apparatus, which actually makes us extremely vulnerable. And again, when we're looking at cyber in terms of organised crime, all these regulations are coming through to stop money laundering stuff. It's largely the banks nailing people on the street for minor infringements, while in terms of these big things that we looked at, like, I think it's like the New Zealand was mentioned in the Paradise Conspiracy Theory like 60,000 times. And then on top of it, you had companies like guys like Alexander Vitnik, who ties right back to 412 Takapuna Drive in Auckland, along with, and this was a major hacker for cyber. He was a cyber banker for hackers operating out of Cyprus, and the Russians got a lot of the blame. But actually, I would probably kind of like go, probably more likely the Israelis under that particular situation. But these guys drew back to these nominating companies that weren't being investigated. Banks were calling alarm bells on them, just like they did with Proc Bank, the bank that Ross Morank was involved in. And nobody did anything right up until about 2018 or 2017, right after when Cameron Ortis, who was brought in to investigate the Ozark and the New Zealand-Australian connections, discovered as a spy himself in Canada. Then a lot of money movement, action took place against dodgy money that was coming into New Zealand, but not until then. So they had a pretty much like a 20-year, 25-year free run. And again, when you look at Takapuna Drive and you look at the sketchy Russian money that was involved in there, and the sketchy, basically my concern from what I saw and what I'm working on now in another project, which we won't call State Secrets 3, but it covers a lot of stuff, is it was actually the Chinese that concerned me more. And again, even this conflict that we're fighting right now between Russia and the West, Ukraine and Russia, to me it's a really stupid conflict, because while the West and Russia are actually tearing each other apart, there is only one real winner. It doesn't matter who wins the Ukraine, it's actually China that wins. And we are, we're setting ourselves into a situation which may very well result in another global war and lots of paranoia and drama, because instead of actually stepping away from the brink in the Ukraine and West versus East in the Ukraine, and addressing that there is actually three players, what we're doing is we're becoming narrow focused between Russia and and the West. And meanwhile, China's busily doing its thing, and we really need to bring them onto the equation, and everyone needs to be stepping back and saying, let's do all our spycraft and all our espionage stuff. Let's keep it diplomatic. Let's keep it without having to descend to a Cold War, where one side, and this again gets into things like, this is all timing. All this stuff is occurring at the same time when we're building all these big AI centres, which are clearly about the military-industrial complex. And again, if you look at the shipping news that I'm doing now, which I think Shipping News 59, which is we embedded, I'll put the link onto this particular YouTube, we get in there about how these AI centres are being built, and these are things which I have been writing about and screaming my head off in the wilderness since probably 2000, in fact 2000 and, I'm going to go 2011, 2012, because that's when I spoke to David Kennedy about the Arawara space station. Said, you do realise it's got a military component? And he said, oh, no, that's not likely, because my friend Robert McDeal, Space Operations, is running it, and he would have told me. Now, we now know that the Space Operations Centre, which has gone from one little mushroom dome into like 20 domes, and go boop, 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 and no one's paying any attention to that. And you're going, well, what do you think? what do you think this AI centre, who do you think it's actually for? And this big cable that takes it from there to Australia. And when you turn around and you stop looking at the intelligence connections in New Zealand, which don't tell you anything, but when you start looking at those same companies and you look at the Australian military intelligence connections, you start to go, what we've got going on here is this entire infrastructure that's been set up to, like, well, we're going to do this, we're going to protect our rare critical minerals, and we're going to have to use all this rare critical minerals, building AI data centres and drones out of rare critical minerals to face off against the Chinese and Russians, rare critical minerals in their AI data centre. Mate, it's all so stupid. It's a whole consumption of mass resources leading into automated mass slaughter. World War One, World War Two tells us this. 600 oak trees as you drive through the city of township of Elmaru. Each one planted for some young guy who never made 22, who didn't come back from the First World War, and those trees were planted to remind us of the stupidity of automated mechanised slaughter. This is where we're heading, okay? And all these spy stories, all drum, this is all about creating a climate. It's a climate of our friend over here. She'll go over there. I'll bring you in and on it. That's the cover. That's actually Rick Baker from Gripper did that for me, and that's the cover of the reimpression of the reprint of State Secrets, of which the person that printing that is Vincent J. McLeod Publishing, whose total payments that he's given to me for my books these days has been $34. And that was probably about, maybe 5-6 years ago. And he still has his books on his page, and he's still selling them. And I haven't received a cent, so I just put that in there. So Vincent J. McLeod, what a rip-off agent. And yeah, we are going to be dealing to you as well. But the point was, that book was so popular that we were able to get a reprint of it done nearly 10 years after it's been print. And it's a book you can find on my website. Again, go to the Ben book, click. It's completely free. If you do want to leave a donation because you recognise the work and effort that's gone into it, great. But generally speaking, if you want to be a subscriber, then come and be a subscriber. I like to have my community small, because that way you can talk to me directly and ask me and use me, not just as giving me money, but you use me as like an organic AI chat things on national security issues. And yeah, so it still keeps being, it's still getting cited around the world in different universities. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, basically the contribution which occurred, which keeps on getting proven again and again and again, just gets sidebarred and media blackout, which we've already explained. Anyway, have a good day. And I thought that was my little kind of contribution about explaining a little bit more about how spycraft and intelligence actually operates in New Zealand and the Five Eyes dynamic, and which we'll get into the whole Five Eyes and another day. But we'll do another video after this, which I'll put down below, which will be getting into that story question, but I'll do that a little bit later than today. And so you should be hopefully having this with your bacon and eggs on Saturday morning.